Is that the current state of play in Washington with this administration, aligning itself with Moscow, with Russia, the aggressor in this war?
I would not say there's anything in that document that I think would lead anyone looking at the substance of a national strategy and actions.
Except Moscow's welcomed it. They welcomed it warmly, and they would only do that if it was in alliance with what they think.
Well, let's not fall into a Russian cognitive warfare campaign.
As the Prime Minister welcomes President Zelensky and the leaders of France and Germany to Downing Street, Europe faces an important moment. The aim is to shape the US-led plan to end the war. But after Washington's new national security strategy appeared to sideline Ukraine and ease pressure on Moscow, there is growing anxiety that any proposed peace could weaken Ukraine and Europe. Russia's warm reaction to the document has only increased those concerns. This meeting follows 3 difficult days of talks in Florida, where Ukraine pushed back against a plan many see as too close to President Putin's demands. The strain was clear when President Trump publicly questioned whether President Zelensky had even read it. The UK continues to promise support for as long as it takes, but what that means if the US shifts its stance is becoming harder to ignore. There are renewed calls to use the $140 billion in frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine's defence. Meanwhile, President Putin says he will fight on until Russia controls all of Donetsk and Luhansk, despite the heavy losses on the battlefield and deep economic pressure. European leaders have pledged continued military help, but it remains unclear what any coalition of the willing would actually do, especially if enforcing a ceasefire is off the table. The wider US approach matters too. Its new strategy questions Europe's economic and migration policies, downplays NATO, and talks of improving relations with Russia to mitigate the risk of wider conflict. For Europe, those signals are deeply uncomfortable, so today's talks carry weight far beyond the battlefield. European leaders must find a common stance that rejects territorial concessions and secures meaningful guarantees for Ukraine. The problem, as ever, is that Putin refuses any changes and the fighting continues. And this is the real divide. Either Europe asserts a clear strategy that protects Ukraine's sovereignty and its own long-term security, or it risks accepting a settlement shaped by others and favourable to Moscow. A lasting peace will demand resolve, realism and unity, and a firm message that Europe will not reward aggression nor allow Ukraine's future to be written on Russia's terms. I'm Jo Coburn, and this is The Times at 1. So with the US president seemingly changing his tune on Ukraine again, moving away from recent support for President Zelensky, could Trump's inability to pick a side be the main barrier to negotiations that end the war? Well, joining us now is Brent Sadler, Senior Research Fellow, Naval Warfare and Advanced Technology at the Heritage Foundation, who laid out Project 2025, the blueprint for Trump's second term. Welcome to the programme. Where do Trump's loyalties really lie?
I think it's pretty clear to Americans. In America, national security is his number one priority. And looking past the rhetoric, it's pretty clear.
But in terms of loyalties, Russia, Ukraine and Europe, where do his loyalties lie?
Again, it's with the United States. There's been a lot of, often outside of the United States, you get a one-sided viewpoint that characterizes Trump as either being a patsy of Putin or overwhelmingly in favor of autocrats. And the truth is far from that, because it was Trump who actually killed over 100 mercenary Russians in Syria that were getting a little too close to U.S. forces. He's the same president when Obama, for years after the 2014 Maidan protest and Russian intervention, actually sent for the first time lethal equipment, most importantly, the javelins that the Ukrainians were able to use to great effect and to stop the Russian invasion back in February 2022. So I don't buy into the narrative that Trump has a bias or a favorite to Russia. What's really going on, again, look beyond the rhetoric and look at the actual substance. China has becoming increasingly aggressive and belligerent in East Asia, and the United States needs to focus there to prevent what would be a much more disastrous war for itself,
Sure.
but also for Europe, quite frankly.
Right. But in terms of looking beyond the rhetoric, we are looking beyond the rhetoric. We are looking at the substance. And if you look at that document that came out on Friday, it looks to many that the US is selling Europe down the river. The White House's new national security strategy rejects European allies, says America must search for new friends in the West. It concedes the US must share power with China, as you have rightly said. So I say again, is that now the state of realpolitik? No longer friends with Europe?
I'd characterize it more as realism, a return back to realism. And unfortunately, because we, the collective West, have neglected our militaries for far too long and overwhelmingly integrated our economies into our adversaries, Europe, most importantly, with Russian energy, and the United States with a variety of its supply chains into China. So we're in the process of changing and shifting. And I would say it's certainly not a partnership with China. It's a competition, as I read the national security strategy.
Right, but what about with Russia? Russia actually welcomed the new national security strategy, saying it was largely consistent with Moscow's vision. Is that the current state of play in Washington with this administration, aligning itself with Moscow, with Russia, the aggressor in this war?
I would not say there's anything in that document that I think would lead anyone looking at the substance of a national strategy and actions.
Except Moscow's welcomed it. They welcomed it warmly, and they would only do that if it was in alliance with what they think.
Well, let's not fall into a Russian cognitive warfare campaign where they say they like something when they really probably want to try to kill it at the same time. Russia, of course, would welcome anything that doesn't list them as enemy number one. And quite frankly, that's not actually what's at stake right now. It is China that is the number one threat to Western civilization and democracy as we know it. Certainly, their target's been the United States since the bodies were still warm in Tiananmen Square in 1989.
But that does sound to anyone. But that does sound to anyone listening that you just want to get this war over with. You want a resolution as quickly as possible, whatever the cost. I hear what you've said on China. That's fine. You can hold two thoughts though in your mind at the same time, Brent Sadler. When it comes to Russia and Ukraine, which is of imminent importance to not just Ukraine, but Western European leaders, you are basically saying we need to resolve this, get this off the table at any price.
Well, not at any price. Let's be very clear. What is in American interest, and it's been stated time and time again, and I think it's also clear, again, taking one of the documents in the process of a negotiation leaked by someone, probably with self-serving intent, is not the best way to judge it. It's certainly to provide input to it, but what's important is the line of effective control. Look at Kashmir as an example, as historical corollary. Where the line of the two forces step away from, the current front line perhaps is the best starting point. It has to be defensible. It has to be sustainable peace. That's what's in, I think, U.S. and European best interest, and then going forward negotiating the formal boundaries.
Except you say it's in European best interest, but they disagree with you
of course, they continue to buy Russian oil.
Well, on that fact, though, about what's in their long-term interests, for you said not at any price, but perhaps on big concessions. You will admit that. You would give big concessions to try and draw a line and end this war.
No, the only concession is to hold the line where it is right now and to open up discussions later on for where the formal line, the official boundaries will be. Promises of support for forever or until the last Ukrainian is unsustainable. If the Ukrainian front falls and starts to collapse because they run out of Ukrainians, then Russia gains by fiat all the territory that it wants, despite the rhetoric coming out of capitals across Europe. So we have to deal in reality and try to stop the fighting for a host of reasons, one of which is to give time for NATO to rearm, a task that it has shirked for far too long.
All right, Brent Sadler, thank you very much for talking to us.